Well, on a more serious note, I am delighted to get to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects. Because obviously with the pictures on the wall, Jack's wonderful portraits back there, we need to think a little bit about the person for whom this dinner is named tonight, Abraham Lincoln. And I've learned over the years there's basically about 4 different types of Lincoln Day dinner speeches. There's the "I'm the candidate and this is what I want to do for you" speech. There's the "I'm the office holder and this is what I am doing for you" speech, and you ought to feel really good about it. There's the ever popular "Republicans good, Democrats bad" speech. I love giving those, but this is the 200th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln, so I'm going to set that one aside. This one is in kind of the 4th category, in that it is a speech of history. And I love American history. Many years ago, I gave myself the goal to try to read at least 10 pages of American history every night. I've done it now for almost 35 years. And every night, it is just like medicine for me to sit back in the recliner, put the feet up, and grab some new book and start reading. And when we think of Mr. Lincoln, we think it was so long, long, long ago. And yet it really wasn't. Because last year at a dinner like this, and this is a true story, at a dinner like this up in Howard County in Kokomo, I was being introduced, and the county chairman there is a fellow by the name of Craig Dunn. I'm a history buff in that I love to read history. Craig Dunn is an honest-to-goodness historian in that he's written several texts of history. And what he's written about specifically has been the Indiana regiments that served in the Civil War. And all of the people in attendance, of course, knew of Craig's background as a historian, so when he walked to the podium that night, kind of starting the evening, he said, "Well, I see a lot of gray hair here tonight. This is a Lincoln Day dinner. Would any of you remember Mr. Lincoln?" And everyone laughed. And then he said, "Well, would any of your parents have remembered Mr. Lincoln?" And everyone laughed. And then a little lady sitting about where Pat was sitting raised her hand. Her name is Marvella Butcher. When Marvella Butcher's father was born, James Buchanan was President of the United States before Abraham Lincoln. He was born in 1855. True story. Ms. Butcher is 70 years old. Oh, I can see the wheels spinning. I can see you doing the math. When she was born, her father was 77 years old. I don't know how old her mother was, but I'm guessing not 77. Unless her name was Sarah. And it is amazing. And afterwards, I went up and spoke to her, and I said, "Ms. Butcher," and she's a very young 70, by the way. I said, "Ms. Butcher, it's just amazing to me that between you and your father, you spanned 147 years of American history." And she tapped me on the arm and said, "Thus far, thus far." You can tell she's got great vigor, and she's going to be there for many more years. But I tell you that story just to remind you that while it's American history, and it seems so long ago, it can be spanned in but 2 lifetimes. In getting to speak of Mr. Lincoln, I could come here tonight and kind of lay out the biography, and that might be interesting to some of you, but frankly it's kind of hard to do and make it interesting. And so what I've chosen to do instead is, I think I've asked a very human question, which is, how would Mr. Lincoln want to be remembered? You know, for all of what we see of this guy whose picture is on the $5 bill, whose face we see everywhere, whose quotes we read incessantly, he was just another human being. He had his good points, he had his bad points, he had things I'm sure he was intensely proud of. And I'm sure he had things he was embarrassed about. And I think all of us wonder at times, how will we be remembered? So I think it would be normal for him to have had that thought. So I think if Abraham Lincoln were here today and telling us how he would want to be remembered, I think the first thing he might say to us is that he would like to be remembered as a person of integrity, because he truly was. You know, growing up not far from here, and it's important to remember in this bicentennial celebration, yes, he may have been born in Kentucky, but when he was 7 years old, they moved to Indiana. He lived here until he was 21. That's what some call the formative years. He spoke with a Hoosier accent. And I've always thought It was Indiana that made Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln that made Illinois, in that order. And when he was growing up in Spencer County, his father, who was a very strict Baptist, apparently really put the thought of integrity and honesty in his mind. Even as a young boy, the stories began to circulate how incredibly honest this young person was. The wonderful idea of how far would you walk for a book. That's based on Abraham Lincoln, you know. Because there were very few books, and he loved to read. And he would walk great distances to get a book. And he would make a promise always to return it in the condition in which it was borrowed. One night he'd gone somehow almost all the way to Huntingburg and got a book on Washington. Took it back with him and apparently was reading it by the fire there in the cabin. And then at nighttime he went up into the loft, kind of wedged the book up between a couple logs in the ceiling, and as luck would have it, a downpour came down that night and basically ruined the book. The next day he walked all the way back towards Huntingburg to explain what had happened and to promise that somehow he would pay for the book. And this was a young man who probably, literally did not have a penny. But he was going to somehow work off that debt. When he moved to Illinois at the age of 21, kind of separated from his father. His father was very much dedicated to being a farmer, and that was not what Abraham Lincoln saw in his future. So he decided to go into business. He joined a partner called William Berry. They started a little mercantile store, Lincoln and Berry. It wasn't very long, and Lincoln decided that isn't what he wanted to do either. And he sold his interest. Mr. Berry bought him out. And then something else happened, not really sure quite what, but suddenly Mr. Berry decided he didn't want to be in the store, and he went off and left something like $1,600 in debt. Lincoln had no legal obligation whatsoever to pay off that debt. But he knew people associated his name with that little business. And so he took it upon himself to pay off what he subsequently called his own national debt. Because $1,600 in the 1830s was a huge amount of money. It took him more than 20 years to do it. And it's from that he began to get that reputation as Honest Abe. Once when practicing law in a courtroom, he was acting as what we would call today a public defender. His integrity was known far and wide. There was a person on trial for beating up his wife. He was a real scoundrel, and yet Lincoln was there to defend him. And Lincoln's law partner, Billy Herndon, was sitting on the bench behind him. Someone got up and attacked in the witness stand that fellow and said, yeah, he did it, he did this and this and this. It just painted a horrible picture of the person Lincoln was trying to defend. And Lincoln turned to his law partner and said, Billy, you're going to have to defend this guy because I can't do it. Now, I can't imagine what a 21st century judge would do if a lawyer said that in front of a court. Probably have him disbarred. But that was Abraham Lincoln's integrity. I think if Abraham Lincoln were here today, he would want to be remembered as a lawyer because Lincoln loved the practice of law. As I said a moment ago, his father wanted to be with him and be the farmer hand. Grow up, take over whatever little plot of land they might have, but Lincoln did not want to work with his hands. He wanted to work with his mind. Totally self-taught. There were no law schools, well, there weren't in this part of the country. There were back east. Lincoln got copies of what are known as Blackstone journals and read them and reread them and reread them and reread them until he understood the case law and the very basis of English law. He was mentored for a short time. And yet the truth is, as prosperous as Lincoln became as a lawyer, and he was very prosperous, the truth is, he wasn't really a brilliant lawyer. He was never going to be on the Supreme Court. And in fact, if Abraham Lincoln were alive today and practicing law, he would be the type of lawyer you see advertising on television. And his commercial would probably start with the words, "Have you been injured in an accident?" Because that's the kind of law Lincoln practiced.